Good evening, friends. I hope that you can all hear me well. Just give me a heads up if there is a problem. The difference between this and the previous talks, of course, is that today I am turning on the screen sharing feature over here on Facebook Live, and I hope that you will be able to see some slides that I'll be showing you. So here goes. This talk today is a slight modification of a talk that I had intended to give, uh, having been invited by ICOMOS to talk about the architecture of New Delhi. Now, the architecture of New Delhi, of course, there a lot has been written about it, a lot has been said about it. There have been many talks, many books on this. I think there is still something that needs to be said. And the reason for my saying so is that often the architecture has been seen in isolation from the political discourse that went behind it. Now, that is, I presume, I think in some ways it is not surprising because it is architectural historians, it is architects who have studied this architecture. Now, that's where interdisciplinarity really comes in, because when and I am a historian, so I approached it as a historian. I don't know about architecture. So I studied it as a historian, and that's when I think came to the conclusion that really to properly understand the architecture of New Delhi, you need to you need to do both. You need to look at you have to go into the archive of the government archive, the correspondence that was taking place at the level of the government decision making and the architects, and what are they actually saying about this, how is this developing, rather than looking at the finished product, i.e. the buildings, and then drawing conclusions. Now, so with this little and what is the common wisdom has been about New Delhi, that this it is, of course, it was the building of a new city. New Delhi was a new capital city for the British in India, of a great uh, empire. And it is an imperial vision, it is an authoritarian imperial vision that is being worked out over here. And while all that is very true, I think what the archive tells us is a little bit more about the precise nature of this empire that was developing. So, if you will bear with me, I will be showing some photographs that will come a little later, but I'm going to give a little bit of background. Let me start off with showing at least what you see on your screens right now, and I hope you can see that, is an image of the temporary capital. This was a building, this is now the Delhi Assembly building. This was the temporary secretariat that was built in 1912, because the capital actually shifted in 1912. So from 1912 to when the formal capital was inaugurated, and slowly the secretariat functions began to move in 1926, but the formal inauguration did not happen till February 1931. So for a long time, this was the temporary capital. So this is a picture. I won't be talking much about this one, but let me move on. And you will have to forgive me. Facebook tends to sort of worsen the quality of pictures. I think that is what I discovered when I give this a trial run. And I'm sorry about that, but we will go on and have a look at what. So I will try and advance these slides. So, a little bit about the history of British architecture in Delhi as such, because this is in many ways a story of Delhi too. And the British had gained administrative control of the city in 1803 when the East India Company defeated the Marathas and conquered Delhi. One of the first things they did was, of course, was to build or uh, try to create spaces for their own administrative purposes. The highest administrative officer in Delhi was the resident, and the residency, his office, had to be built. And what they did at that point was actually take a pre-existing building, which had been a mansion which belonged to Dara Shikoh, the Mughal prince, and they added a facade to it, a classical facade to it, and recreated it and sort of restamped it, dressed it up as a colonial building. So this is what you see here. This building is now called the Dara Shikoh Library Building. It's in near Kashmiri Gate within the Ambedkar University campus. Now, if you go inside, I'm sorry, this photograph is an old one. This has changed since then. Also, work has been going on over here. When you go inside, behind those columns that colonnaded now enclosed veranda, when you go inside, this is what you see. This is the Mughal layer of the building. But this is what they did. They modified a very makeshift adaptation, but an adaptation nevertheless. They wanted to establish their stamp on the official building, even though it wasn't a reused building. After a while, this happens in the first decade of the 19th century. A little bit down the line, in the 1840s, there is a further development when the commissioner, by that time, the British have settled down. They have become much more comfortable with the city, with its people, and the house that the then commissioner, uh, uh, Thomas Metcalfe builds. This is called Metcalfe House. And what you're seeing here, by the way, the photographs are used from many different sources. I'm going to acknowledge them as I go along. This is from the Delhi State Archives, this particular photograph. This is Metcalfe House. It's called Metcalfe House these days. And Metcalfe House was if, as you can see, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but it's a long building. It's of an amalgamated sort of style. It has an overall colonial look and features, but for instance, the veranda, the arches are pointed arches, pointed Mughal arches. So a sort of a mingling of styles happening over here. And then comes a major break in the history of Delhi, which is the revolt of 1857. Now, the revolt of 1857 leads to a great hardening of positions. And in the immediate aftermath of 1857, on the one hand, we see a deliberate erasure of important landmarks of Indian Mughal architecture. So, about more than 95% of the buildings of the Red Fort are completely demolished. Important places like what was Chandni Chowk, the main square of the city, important public buildings there are destroyed. The Chowk itself is demolished. There was a large sarai which had been built by Shah Jahan's daughter Jahanara. That was also demolished. In its place comes a very, very colonial style building. There's nothing Indian about this. This is the town hall, by the way. The town hall looks a little different these days because that colonnaded veranda on top, is the balcony type thing, is not there anymore. It was dismantled at some point. So that is not there anymore. But this was the mood at that time. This is the 1860s. Also in the 1860s comes the clock tower. Now, this building actually has disappeared since then. It's a Gothic style clock tower. Again, a very, very emphatically colonial, not only a colonial style, but the whole concept of a clock tower, of course, is a colonial one, of imposing order on a very disorderly population. That's the idea behind it, that the Indian people did not understand the importance of rules and regulations and keeping time, and therefore this was a colonial lesson that they were being taught. So that was the kind of politics that went behind this architecture of the second half of the 19th century after the revolt. In any case, a lot of public buildings were not being built at that time because Delhi had become a bit of a backwater. Delhi had was in the doghouse, so to speak, right after the revolt. So not a lot of major public buildings were being built here. And then comes a very, very different moment, and this is 1911. This is a picture which is quite well known, of the Darbar of 1911. The idea of the Darbar, of these great assemblies where Mughal emperors had gathered their feudatories around them, had these big assemblies. This was a very it was a Mughal uh, tradition which had been adapted and adopted wholeheartedly by the British East India Company, and or not they had also had darbars on smaller levels, but with the coming of with the takeover of India by the crown, these were really developed into major coronation darbars as well. We had coronation darbars, one in 1877 when Queen Victoria took the title of Empress of India, and then further two rulers also on their coronations, on the occasion of their succession to the throne and the title of Emperor of India, their darbars were also held. This is the darbar of George V. And what you see here is George V and his wife Mary giving darshan to their Indian subjects from the Jharokha darshan. This Jharokha darshan was a Mughal space. It was a little window which was there in the Musamman Burj and in the abutting the Khas Mahal. And this was where the Mughal emperors too had shown themselves to their Indian subjects. The concept of giving darshan was a very Indian one. The Mughals had adapted it, and the British after them adapted it. Now, this moment is a very important one because, of course, it was during the Darbar that the Mughal that George V had also made the announcement that Delhi would become the capital of British India. The capital would move from Calcutta, where it had been so far, and it would come to Delhi. Now, this was meant, and I think this needs to be studied also. It has been, but I think it has not been given enough popular currency, shall we say. Not a lot of people really people know that, yes, it was moved from Calcutta. Why was it moved? And I think we need to look at a particular document. There is a document which is in which the then Governor General Harding had actually put forward this proposal in 1911 to the government, to the Secretary of State in Britain, and this is what the document said. In its third paragraph, it said, "It is certain that in the course of time, the just demands of Indians for a larger share in the government of the country will have to be satisfied. And the question will be how this devolution of power can be conceded without impairing the supreme authority of the Governor General in Council. The only possible solution of the difficulty would be gradually giving the provinces a larger measure of self-government until at last India would consist of a number of administrations autonomous in all provincial affairs, with the government of India above them all and possessing power to interfere in cases of government, but ordinarily restricting their functions to matters of imperial concern." Now, that is a very important point to appreciate, that the political motive behind the transfer of capital itself was one of giving a greater autonomy to provinces and to gradually decrease the British role to that of an overarching imperial power, not one that tightly controlled every single detail. An overall, it would look at broader aspects of governance. So this was the political imperative behind the transfer of the capital itself. I am now feeling an earthquake. So let's see how that develops. Hopefully, it will not. Once that had been acknowledged, that we needed to that Indians needed more uh, responsibility, and that would come slowly. And the first step in that was giving the provinces greater autonomy. Came the idea of where this capital would move to. And that answer to that actually was arrived at very, very quickly, because this is what Harding wrote to the Secretary of State. He said, Delhi is still a name to conjure with. It is intimately associated in the minds of the Hindus with sacred legends which go back even beyond the dawn of history. Now, here he was referring to the idea that Indraprasth had been the capital of the Pandavas and Indraprasth was in Delhi. To the Mohammedans, it would be a source of unbounded gratification to see the ancient capital of the Mughals restored to its proud position as the seat of the empire. So the idea is to make this whole, the transfer of capital is essentially one that is supposed to be of benefit to Indians. That is the idea behind the transfer of the capital, that the moving away of the capital from Calcutta to give it greater autonomy, that is an important factor. And then choosing Delhi, which is to give the people of that, it would be something that would be acceptable to the people of India. That was the idea that was being considered behind it. So I think that is something that we do need to look at a little bit more. Uh, we have to give a little bit more attention to that particular factor as well. Now, we come next to the question of what was this new capital? What was the new capital that had to be built? What were the and the idea of that also begins to come very, very quickly. It was right within the Darbar itself that George V made a statement on that as well. And he said, "It is my desire that the planning and designing of the public buildings to be erected will be considered with the greatest deliberation and care, so that the new creation may be in every way worthy of this ancient and beautiful city." He does not say that it should be worthy of British power or of British aesthetics, of British architecture, but that it should be worthy of this ancient and beautiful city. I think that is something that we do need to look at. Now, the image that you're seeing on your, and I hope that has come up now, of the central vista, that is a beautiful photograph by Sandeep Shankar. So do credit to him. I am using his photographs for this presentation. So this was a very important idea, that it should be the architecture of Delhi that you should be drawing on, or the architecture of India that should be that you should be drawing on. And then this debate immediately started. So just 10 days after the Darbar, there was a letter which was written in the newspapers through the Times by somebody called E.B. Havell, and he was a retired principal of the Calcutta School of Art. And in this letter, what he said about what is the kind of architecture that should really be employed in Delhi. And what he says is that by shifting to Delhi, we will leave the commercial atmosphere of Calcutta with its shoddy imitations of European architecture, and then Britain will find itself in the heart of Hindustan, where the artistic traditions of Indian buildings are still, for all practical architectural purposes, as much alive as they were when Akbar, by calling into the service of the state the skill of temple builders, gave Saracenic, which means, by which he meant Islamic, architecture in India a wonderful new impulse. So that is, according to Havell, this was what they needed to do. The builders of the new capital had to follow in the footsteps of Akbar. This was an idea which was expressed even by uh, people from within the country. For instance, there was F.O. Ortel, who had been a superintending engineer in Allahabad in the CPWD, and he came up with very, very similar ideas. In a talk, he talked about those. There were of course those who were advocating a very, very strongly colonial style. He said those who advocate a colonial Renaissance style forget the true significance of the move to Delhi and of our position in the country. We are not in India as colonists intent on making a home there as nearly like the one we have left behind, but rather to exercise imperial sway with the consent of the people and for their benefit. For India's benefit alone and according to Indian sentiment, thereby consolidating the union between India and England for mutual advantage. He too, of course, also went on to say that if we need a truly national style, then we will have to emulate Akbar. And why emulate Akbar? Because Akbar has this idea of blending existing styles with new impulses and creating something that is truly national, truly new, innovative. So that is the kind of argument that went behind the development of an Indian style. So what again now, how does this translate into the architecture? Now the architecture, we have heard the name of Lutyens, we have heard the name of Baker. There was of course a town planning committee which was appointed first, and the major town plan had been developed by them, and there also the names of Brodie and George Swinton and Edwin Lutyens were the three members of the town planning committee. I have talked about in an earlier lecture about the choosing of the site for the capital, so I won't go into that now. But certainly their second idea was the town plan, and one aspect of the town plan that we really is what we today call the Central Vista. This is a grand ceremonial avenue. This is the one which stretches from what you see on your screen, hopefully, from the Rashtrapati Bhavan, through the secretariats, through Vijay Chowk, right up to India Gate, the Memorial Chhatri, and onwards. That Central Vista. And this is what was finally developed, and this was the main avenue. This obviously has parallels and inspirations from elsewhere also. There is the Washington Mall, for instance. This is very much one of the inspirations for the Central Vista. The other was Champs-Élysées in Paris, which from the Arc de Triomphe to the Louvre. So those inspirations were very, very much there. But this also, incidentally, there was a avenue in the 17th century city of Delhi, the Mughal city, which was Shahjahanabad. That was the road that we today call Chandni Chowk, and it was a very similar avenue leading from the main citadel. So definitely there were precedents in the Indian tradition as well. Anyhow, this photograph, which you see, hopefully it has popped up on your screens. I'm sorry, Facebook does tend to decrease the quality of the photographs. I don't seem to be able to get around it. You will see the Rashtrapati Bhavan flanked by the Secretariat blocks. Now here also we will see one important feature of these buildings, the stone that is used. The stone that is used is red and beige sandstone, very much the color of the monumental buildings of Delhi, the imperial buildings of Delhi. Many of the imperial buildings were built of red sandstone. The Red Fort, of course, immediately comes to mind. The Mughals, for many of their monumental buildings, and even before that, other dynasties also used red sandstone and marble. Now, marble on this scale, of course, would have been extremely expensive, so marble was not used, but a beige sandstone was used, very much drawing inspiration from Delhi's monumental architecture. Uh, this is a map which, when I was talking about, it was not just the color of the sandstone that was picked from, that was chosen, or was the inspiration from the older city of Delhi, of Shahjahanabad, for instance. There were other inspirations also, and this is one of them. And I don't know how well you can see this, but I'll try and describe it as best as I can. This is a map which shows in black the old city, Shahjahanabad, and the imperial city, and it is labeled Imperial Delhi, the imperial city in the outlined in red. And there you see a very interesting thing. The Rajpath, Central Vista, is exactly parallel to the road which we call Chandni Chowk. So there are these geometries in geometric senses also. There are these great symbolic associations with the older city. Coming now to the two main architects, and I'm going to talk about basically about Lutyens and Baker here, because they were finally appointed to design the main public buildings and also to act as an architectural board to give approvals for the came up that came up in New Delhi. And I think the correspondence is very interesting because Lutyens had been part of the town planning committee, and he was very hopeful that he would get the commission. He would be commissioned to make to design the. He would be the chief architect for New Delhi. And what people don't realize is that it took a long time for his to be finalized for that, because it was a political imperative. Lutyens finally appointed only in January. In January 1930, a year a year after he had already been appointed on the town planning committee. So why this huge gap? Because there is a lot of discussion that happens, because this is the period when all the discussion happens about what should be the architecture. And there comes the problem, because Lutyens was very adamant on a strongly colonial style, and he found no redeeming features in Indian architecture. In fact, he said that I think we should in old England should establish her sway and stop pandering to all the stupid Hindu Mughal things that you all keep talking about. He was very frank in that, and that really made people uncomfortable. Harding, who was the viceroy and whose project this was, and it was a political project. It was not simply an architectural project. This was a hugely political project, and so for him, this made him uncomfortable. And it was interesting that at that particular time, by coincidence, that an article appeared in the Times newspaper. Again, this was written by Herbert Baker. Herbert Baker was already well known as an architect, as the architect of several of the government buildings in Pretoria, and so he was known for public buildings, whereas Lutyens by this time was primarily known as having built very nice houses. Though of course he was also associated with the Hampstead Garden suburb project in England, which was a garden city project. He had built a couple of churches, and he had worked on the main square of that place. But he did not have a huge amount of experience with public buildings. So this is what Baker said. Baker in this letter said, British rule in India is not a mere venue of government and culture. It is a new civilization in growth, a blend of the best elements of East and West. The effect of this will even should British sovereignty ever depart the shores of India. So when this kind of a pronouncement came from an architect, Harding and others just lapped it up. They said, "This is the man," and the in fact the Secretary of State said that there you have a man who's an architect as well as a statesman. And it was only then it was suggested that Kerr should be a part of this team also. It was only when Lutyens agreed to this partnership that he would accept Baker as a collaborator. The commission was then finalized, and it was decided that yes, Lutyens and Baker will share this task. Another person was actually put on that architectural board as a consultant on Indian matters was Swinton Jacob. Now, Swinton Jacob was a name, he was quite advanced in years by this time, but he was the name associated with Indo-Saracenic architecture. I won't go into Indo-Saracenic architecture at that time, but suffice it to say that it was very strongly, it believed in the use of Indian arts and crafts and Indian motifs and designs and things like that as add-ons to modern buildings. So that was a movement. And what happened finally was Swinton Jacobs' collaboration with Baker and Lutyens did not quite work out because mainly ultimately Harding said that it was Lutyens made himself really, really unpleasant, and Swinton Jacob then resigned and went away. But what happens after that is that it is Harding who really contributed and kept Lutyens and Baker on the straight and narrow. And he was the client, of course, so his had to be taken into account. And what we see then developing in the architecture of New Delhi is this collaboration between Harding as the client, making sure that this very important element of design, of including Indian style, is carried forward. And we see, so what this part of my talk then will be on this architecture as we see it in different elements, which really can only be understood in the context of what I have just said about the political developments that are happening at this point. And this will hopefully be of interest also to generally people who are interested in seeing what the architecture of New Delhi really is. So what you see on your screens right now, of course, is Rashtrapati Bhavan, which was Viceroy's house, and in it the Jaipur column. These, what you'll hopefully see come up now is Lutyens' early drawings, sketches. So now you have some of the early sketches, and here if you look at the dome of what was designed for Government House, it's a very, very different dome. It's not the dome that came up, that lantern on top, the cupola, the very high dome on a colonnade. He had the ideas in place, but the dome then turns out very, very differently. And this is how it really comes up. You can see the facade. I'll give you a better look at the dome as well. So what you see here, I don't know how well you can see it and whether you can see my cursor or not, but on the sides, parapet, where you have the colonnade, a large number of pillars. On either side of the pillars, on the roof, at the roof level, are two chhatris. These are little cupolas which are depressed into the parapet. Now, this is a very interesting thing that I'm sorry, of course, there's no scope of going and taking pictures at this moment. It would have been nice to have a proper picture of that chhatri, show you how exactly those chhatris are there. in a typically Indian structure, they would look very, very different. They would be projected up from the parapet, like you see in the Diwan-e Khas, which is your next slide. And the Diwan-e Khas shows these chhatris, uh, they project up the parapet. They are quite high. But since Lutyens had to put the chhatris at the same time, he was not very keen on them. He puts them in such a way that they are depressed into the parapet itself. More, much more noticeable is, of course, the dome. And this is a very interesting dome because here the style really is taken very, very heavily inspired by another, an ancient Indian building, in fact. This is the stupa at Sanchi. So the stupas, the collection of stupas in Sanchi, and it could have been a combination of those styles. They date for up to almost 2000 years ago. And this was, and one of Harding's major concerns was he wanted to send Lutyens and Baker on these tours of central India and tours of North India, and he did. And he said, go and take notes, go and look at what Indian architecture and Indian tradition has to offer, because Lutyens was very quick to jump to these conclusions that there was really nothing to be learnt from architecture. And Harding said that if you find Mughal architecture, go and look at other kinds of architecture. So they go, and clearly Lutyens is inspired by the Sanchi Stupa. Coming back to that dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan, I wonder if you can see a couple of chhatris on either side of it. They are extremely hard to see from this angle because they are just below that big drum where you see that broad band. They are just that at the extreme ends. Now, as you can see, they are hardly visible. They certainly don't break the outline of the dome. And that's again Lutyens incorporating chhatris that he does not want to incorporate. But because he has been told to, he does it. And here again, the inspiration, he might have got the idea from Hoshang Shah's tomb in Mandu. Mandu was definitely one of the places that they visited. And here you see the chhatris. You are seeing them from a different angle than the Rashtrapati Bhavan dome. But yes, here too, the chhatris are very close to the main dome. And maybe Lutyens thought, I can do that too, and maybe that will help. One form in which he did use strongly Mughal thing, and this photograph, some black and white photographs are from the Royal Institute of British Architects, from their collection. Here on the parapet, you see these saucers, these big saucer or bowl-like features. These are fountains, and the incorporation of water inside the building and even on the rooftops like this was definitely inspired by the Mughal tradition of water inside buildings. So inside the house, also inside Viceroy's house, there were many, there were pools, there were fountains, basins, a lot of water inside the building as well. And of course, on the rooftop. Finally, of course, also in the building was a Mughal garden. This initially just called a formal Indian garden is the Mughal garden. Here again, Lutyens was less than enthusiastic about it to begin with. When it was suggested to him, he said it's too Alice in Wonderlandish for words. They want me to do a Mughal garden. And the idea had actually come, again, Harding was the one asked Lutyens to do this, but the suggestion had been given to Lutyens by Constance Villiers Stewart, who was a historian of Mughal gardens, and she had written a book on Mughal gardens. And her aim had been to influence the making of New Delhi's gardens, and she mentioned that in her book, that one of her imperatives was she wanted to persuade the makers that a Mughal garden would be suitable for the new capital as an as an extension of Government House, in fact, of Viceroy's house. And therefore, this Mughal garden with its terraces, walkways, waterways was included in the design as well. And Lutyens, I think, brilliance as an architect is that he goes to all these things which he doesn't really. He's a perfect architect because he takes his clients' ideas and he really interprets them in a very, very original and creative manner, and that's what makes his New Delhi project so very remarkable. This is another picture. It's another part of the Mughal garden, part of the building where it connects with Mughal garden. I wanted to show this view simply for uh, explain one particular feature, which is the sloping exterior walls. This batter, as it is called, this sloping exterior walls are very much again this fort-like structure, very much a part of a certain era in Indian architecture, and you will see the inspiration coming from buildings like this. This is Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb in Tughlaqabad. So this batter, definitely this the solid walls, and that solid sandstone walls are very, very much a part of Rashtrapati Bhavan, Government House, as it was. Uh, the Mughals were not completely ignored. This jali, which is there in it's in one of the courts inside Rashtrapati Bhavan in Government House. This jali is really, if you see carefully, look at the design of it, how that particular lozenge-like shape, floral patterns is very, very closely modeled on this. And this is the jali inside the Red Fort in a building called the Khas Mahal, which is also the Tasbih Khana. This is where the Mughal emperor really used to sit, and it was a very important building. And you can see the scales of justice, etc. Below that, that jali, it's a very, very close copy of that particular jali. Lutyens, of course, designed other things also. This is India Gate and the canopy. The canopy, of course, originally contained the statue of George V. Later, the statue was removed in the 60s, in the 1960s. But these two structures were designed by Lutyens. And you look at the India Gate, of course, is very clearly in the tradition of classical arches, as the Arc de Triomphe itself is by Roman arches, so the Arc de Triomphe here. But the Chhatri, on the other hand, is much closer in its proportions to something like this. And this is an unknown location, really, but this is one of the paintings made by the Daniels, Thomas and William Daniels, from somewhere in South India. They don't mention where this view is, but these sort of canopies used to be there in temple compounds, and that is where they had seen it. So this is very much a part of that. Interestingly, inside Rashtrapati Bhavan, inside Government House, those political imperatives did not apply quite so much. And there's a very simple reason for that. And that's because inside the building, they're not anticipating that a lot of Indians would be coming inside, or the kind of Indians these powerful symbolic gestures had to be made for. So the inside of this is Darbar Hall, and here again I had a more expansive view of Darbar Hall, but this is what I have right now. Has much more common with, say, Pantheon and Rome, much more in those half dome kind of niches, in the pattern which is here all over the ceiling, but it is only in those half domes. So here inside the Rashtrapati Bhavan, much of the design is in fact not Indian, because that political statement does not have to be made to some extent. I will follow up with a little bit of comment on Baker also. I think Baker also the same thing, put in features and motifs, and but in his case, I think the it looks like a stitching together of things rather than the development of form. So um, this this is the slope as you go up from Vijay Chowk, and if you look at this particular niche here, a closer view, the pillars, the stepped sort of opening, the corbelled opening. Look at the how it is inspired by structures such as, which is the which is this is at Balb's tomb. This is a 13th century structure and modeled on a form that had been used for a long time in India, in Delhi's architecture. You see a lot of it, this kind of corbelled opening. It's very, very clearly modeled on this kind of opening. This much more European, much more classical in its institution. These were modeled on Greco-Roman, and in fact, they called these the temples. This is part of the Secretariat buildings, so he called them the temples. You can see the parallel in the temple of Zeus at Athens, and that is it's in a ruined condition top, but you can see the pillars and how they are arranged are very definitely similar, and what had inspired Baker to make these temples. But I'd like you to look at the pillar capitals here. Are these are Corinthian capitals. These with acanthus leaves on top. So blossoming out of the main column, you have the capital of acanthus leaves. These are typically this was known as the Corinthian order of pillar capital. So Corinthian order. And what Baker does is to really reinterpret the Corinthian column, and how he interprets the Corinthian column is to add elephant heads to it. So if you can see this picture, and I don't know how you can see it, but the corners you have elephant heads. Now, both Lutyens and Baker had a bit of a weakness for elephant, and I guess that's a bit of a cliche that if you want to Indianize something, the safest way to go is add an elephant and it's Indian. They could not, I think, resist that temptation to find that solution as a solution out of many of their design problems. Now, Baker's domes for the Secretariat are definitely not Indian at all. They are much closer to things like St. Peter's Basilica. You can see the proportions. Definitely there. Again, what he does, one way of getting over the problem of how to say that this is Indian. No, it's not Indian. So if you look at it carefully, jalis have been put in here. These pierced stone screens, these jalis have been put into the openings. And of course, elephants. Again, clustering close to the dome are elephant heads. So you can, if you add elephant heads, then yes, definitely you can say that this is more Indian. Jalis, of course, were a very important part of a lot of Indian architecture. This is from Humayun's tomb. This particular jali inspired Baker in his jalis of in the Secretariat building. This is another one of Baker's chhatri he put chhatris also, and he made nice prominent chhatris, not the abbreviated ones like Lachyans, but there he made chhatris. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but if you look at the the above chhajja, chhajja is that overhang, which gives the shade, and just above that, if you look at the pattern, there's a particular pattern in red sandstone against the beige base. And if you look at that pattern and if you compare it to these chhatris, they're definitely parallel. So he took as his model these chhatris are from the horse complex. It's from the 14th century in Delhi. So Tughlaq period. So these were definitely inspired by chhatris like these. Uh, the entrance to Norfolk, this, if you look at it, it's a rectangle within which there is a round arch. The actual doorway is a rounded arch, and a small balcony and a window. And this, if you see parallels with, this is Arab Ki Sarai, the gateway to Arab Ki Sarai in the Humayun's tomb complex. Very similar proportions. The arrangement is very similar. You have again within a rectangular frame. You have, in this case, of course, a pointed arch. That was one point on which Bakers and Luckin put their foot down, and they said, no, we will not make pointed arches. We will only make round arches. So pointed arches, but again, the smaller doorway inside that big framing arch, a smoker and balcony up there, and medallions in on either side as well. So definitely parallels being drawn there. In front of the Secretariat building is the what we know as the columns of dominion. Now, these columns of dominion also, this is a closer look at the capital. Columns of dominion. There, I will try and get you a. Now, definitely, there are points of intersection with a very iconic, to us iconic today, because this is now the emblem of India, the capital. This is, of course, a modern capital. It's a capital. It is what is known as the bell capital. It's a bell capital with the chakra, a band with a chakra, and these elephant and bull and lion at the bottom. The lions, of course, the four lions at the crest. So this is the Sarnath capital. Now, if you look at how this pillar capital has been inspired by that, at the top, of course, is the bronze sailing ship. These are columns of dominion. They were other dominions of the British Empire, and they symbolize the ships on top of the globe symbolizes how the dominions are connected by water. They are far flung, connected by the seas. But below that is a reverse form of that inverted bell. This goes up as like a lotus, and below that, of course, is that band with the animals and the chakra in the middle. So definitely part of that. As I said, that Lutyens and Baker had been sent off on this tour of central India to go and examine the architecture of Mandu and other places to see how Indianize the architecture of things. It is said that they were inspired in, or Baker was who designed Parliament House, and this is an early photograph of Parliament House. It is a circular, it's a ring, and within that there are these three projections inwards, and in the center is a hall. So this is the design of Parliament House, and we have that it definitely some of inspiration must have from a particular temple in the Morena district in what is now Madhya Pradesh. It's the Mitauli, in a place called Mitauli, this beautiful Chaussat Yogini temple. And if you look at the air, this is a Madhya Pradesh government image, which I have taken, downloaded from the net. And as you can see, it's also a ring with a colonnade running in towards the inside, and a colonnaded circular piece also. So it's not far fetched to imagine that some amount of inspiration might come from there. Uh, Finally, coming to the end of this, an important part of the buildings, of this whole ensemble of buildings, were the houses of the princely states of India, those which were under the sovereignty of the British Crown, but were independently ruled in many ways. So they were given they were given a chance to acquire land in the new capital and build their own palaces. Now, there too, it was decided that if there is this theme which is being developed, there is an architecture of empire, but it's the architecture of a new empire which talks about the cooperation between Indians and Britons, and how, and expressing that cooperation which they had spoken of, and again, of the meeting of East and West. So if this architecture is symbolizing that meeting of East and West, then the princes too have to who have to participate in that project. So this, for instance, what you see here is Jaipur House. Now the idea was that it is Jaipur House, but it cannot be Jaipur House. It cannot be Jaipur's house in a stylistic sense. The princes also were incorporated in collaborative project for developing a new style for Delhi and for this imperial new reinvented empire, which was based on this kind of cooperation with the people of India. They had to also be a part of this. How it worked out was that there was an architecture board headed by Lutyens and Baker, which approved these buildings. And since it was known that they would be approving buildings for their conforming to the style of New Delhi, many princes, of course, very astutely realized that it would be the best way to achieve this would be either to actually engage these architects themselves, or junior architects were offices. So many of the buildings were designed, some of them were designed by Lutyens, some of them were designed by people who had worked in their offices like Blomfield. So this is how the architecture of New Delhi worked out, from based on the kind of political discourse that was happening at of course there were limitations, a limit to how much symbols them alone can achieve. And the reality of colonial rule, of course, was very, very different. And ultimately, it was a project that that remained at the level of symbols alone. And but in the process, it has left behind an architectural legacy that is certainly very, very striking, and some great examples of town planning and architecture itself. So I will now. This is this of the talk comes to an end. I am done with this, but I will be able to, I hope, take questions also. It has lasted a little longer than I intended to, but I'd be very happy to answer questions for if you have any. I will look at them right away and move on. Let's try. Okay.